okay, I think something is changing here. And honestly, I don't think the biggest change is happening with them. I think it's happening with you. Because the first card we have is the Four of Cups. And this is interesting because when I look at this card, I don't immediately see someone who has completely stopped caring. No, I see someone who's tired, tired of thinking about the same situation, tired of wondering, tired of looking for answers that maybe the other person should have given a long time ago. And maybe that's exactly where you've been. For a while, this connection may have taken up so much space in your mind. You wake up and they're there. Something reminds you of them, and suddenly you're thinking again. You wonder what they're doing. You wonder if they miss you. You wonder if they're ever going to say something. And then, eventually, you get tired. Not because you suddenly stopped caring overnight, but because your mind can't keep carrying the same emotional weight forever. And I think that's what this Four of Cups is showing. You're starting to pull your energy back, maybe slowly, maybe without even realizing it. You're not checking as much. You're not imagining every possible outcome as much. You're starting to have moments where you actually focus on something else, your own life, your own plans, your own peace. And I know that can feel strange because when you've been emotionally attached to a situation for so long, letting go doesn't always feel empowering at first. Sometimes it just feels empty. It's like, wait, if I'm not thinking about them, then what am I supposed to do with all of this space in my mind? But I think that's exactly where the shift begins. Because the Four of Cups feels like that moment when you stop chasing emotional answers, not because you finally received them, but because you're beginning to realize that constantly searching for them is exhausting you. And here's where this gets really interesting. Because while you may be sitting there thinking, I don't know, maybe I'm actually starting to let this go, I don't think the other side of this connection is as unaffected as you think. Wait, because I think there may have been a time when this person felt very comfortable with the fact that you cared. Maybe they never said that. Maybe they never consciously thought it. But there is a difference between knowing someone cares and suddenly wondering if they still do. And I think someone may be starting to feel that difference. Not because you're trying to make them jealous, not because you're playing a game, but because your energy is genuinely beginning to change. You're getting tired of waiting. And the strange thing is, I don't think they expected you to. Because what happens when the person who was always emotionally available starts becoming emotionally unavailable? What happens when you stop looking toward them and they finally look back? Because I have a feeling that's where this story really begins. And I think this is where the moon comes in because the moon is interesting here, not because I think it means this person suddenly knows exactly what they want. Actually, I think it could be the opposite. I think they may be starting to feel something before they fully understand it, like something is different, and they can't quite put their finger on why. Because think about it, when someone has been emotionally available to you for a long time, you don't always notice the availability itself. It just becomes normal. You know they're there. On some level that if you wanted to reach out, you probably could. You know that somewhere in the background, they still care. And maybe this person got comfortable with that. Again, not necessarily in some calculated way. I don't think they were sitting there thinking, oh, they're always going to wait for me. But sometimes you don't realize how much access you have to someone until that access starts changing. And I think that's what feels different now because you're still there, you're not disappearing, you're not necessarily blocking them. You're not creating some huge, dramatic moment, but emotionally, maybe you're not standing in the same place anymore. Maybe before, if they crossed your mind, you would stay there for a while. You'd start thinking, analyzing, wondering. And now, maybe the thought still comes, but it doesn't stay as long. And I think that's a bigger change than you realize. Because this person may be beginning to sense that something about the connection doesn't feel as familiar anymore. Okay, not necessarily because they know you've let go. They may not consciously understand that, but maybe they're starting to wonder, why aren't they hearing from you? Why does it feel like you're doing something different with your life? Why do they suddenly feel curious about what you're doing? And that's where the moon feels important, because the moon isn't giving me this energy of immediate action. It's giving me awareness that starts quietly, questions that appear when you're alone, thoughts that come back when you thought you'd already pushed them away, and maybe this person is starting to notice little things now. The silence, the space, the fact that you don't seem to be reaching toward them in the same way. And the strange thing is, I don't think they expected that space to affect them, because maybe when you were waiting, they had the freedom to stay distant. But when you stop waiting, suddenly the distance belongs to both of you. And that's different. So now I'm curious, because if they're beginning to notice that you're no longer emotionally waiting in the same way, what exactly are they starting to realize they might actually be losing? The Seven of Cups feels important, because when I look at the Seven of Cups here, I don't immediately think about some huge dramatic realization. I think about remembering, and maybe that's what starts happening. Because sometimes you don't notice what someone meant to you while everything still feels available. You notice it later, in the quiet, when something reminds you of them. When you see something and your first instinct is still to think, oh, they would understand this, and then you remember. You're not talking. Or maybe you could be, but you're not. And I think that difference might be starting to become more noticeable to this person, because before, your presence may have felt predictable, not in a bad way, just familiar. Maybe they knew you cared. Maybe they knew that even if things were quiet, there was still this emotional connection sitting somewhere in the background. And now, I don't know, it feels less certain. And that's interesting, because uncertainty can make people look more closely at something they stopped noticing. So maybe this person starts wondering about you in these small moments. What are you doing? Who are you spending time with? Are you happier now? Have you moved on? And maybe those questions don't have easy answers, because you're not necessarily trying to show them anything. You're just living, trying to get yourself back, trying to stop giving every quiet moment to this connection. And I think that's the contrast here. You're letting go quietly, and they're becoming curious quietly. You're not making an announcement. You're not saying, look, I'm done. Maybe you're not even completely done. But you're not holding the door open with both hands anymore either. And I think that can create a very strange feeling for the other person. Because sometimes people don't miss constant attention while they're receiving it. They notice it when it becomes uncertain, because that might be what this is. Maybe it's not just that they miss hearing from you. Maybe they're starting to realize they don't actually know where they stand with you anymore. And for a long time, maybe they never had to ask themselves that question, because they assumed you cared. They assumed the connection still mattered to you. They assumed that if they ever wanted to come back, you'd still be there. But now, maybe they're not so sure. And I think that's where the Seven of Cups becomes deeper. Because memories can feel different when you're no longer sure you can recreate them. You start looking back, not just at what happened, but at what you may have had. And maybe what you didn't fully appreciate while it was still right there. So now I'm sitting here wondering something. If this person is finally beginning to question where they stand with you, why did it take you pulling away for them to really start seeing what was there? The High Priestess feels like it understands something that isn't being said. And I think that's the part, maybe this person didn't fully understand what you were giving them while you were still giving it. Your patience, your understanding, the way you kept trying to see things from their side. Maybe there were moments when you could have walked away, but you didn't. Maybe there were moments when they pulled back and you gave them space. Moments when they were confusing and you still tried to understand why. And when you do that for someone long enough, it can become invisible. Not because it has no value, but because they get used to it. They get used to you being the person who understands, the person who doesn't immediately give up, the person who somehow still cares even after things become complicated. And maybe that's what this person didn't see clearly before, or maybe um, they didn't have to. Because as long as you were still emotionally there, they never really had to ask themselves what your absence would feel like. Okay, because this actually makes sense. You may have experienced this connection as something you were constantly trying to understand. You were asking questions, trying to read between the lines, trying to figure out what they felt, why they acted the way they did. But maybe on their side, they were simply used to you still being there. And that doesn't necessarily mean they were trying to take advantage of you. I don't think that's what this is saying. Sometimes people just don't understand the value of consistency until the consistency changes. They don't realize how much comfort they got from knowing someone cared until they can no longer feel that certainty. And now, maybe that's starting to become uncomfortable because the high priestess feels quiet, observant, almost like there are things becoming clearer without anyone actually saying them out loud. Maybe this person is beginning to notice moments from the past differently now. Something you said, something you did, a time when you reached out, a time when you forgave something that actually hurt you. And maybe before, they didn't think much about it. It was just you. That was just how you were with them, but now that you're changing, those memories may not feel so ordinary anymore. And I think that's where something that looks a little bit like regret could start. Not huge regret, not yet. More like, wait, did I realize what that meant at the time? Did I understand how much they were actually giving me? Because there is a difference between remembering something and finally seeing it. And maybe that's exactly what this person is starting to do now. Looking back at moments they once dismissed and wondering if they should have understood them differently. Because Two of Cups actually gives me a slightly different perspective. Because letting go doesn't always mean you stopped caring. Sometimes it just means you can't keep doing the same thing to yourself. And I think that's important because maybe you still care about this person. Maybe you still have moments where something reminds you of them. Maybe you still wonder what they're thinking. Maybe part of you would still want answers. But there's a difference between having feelings and allowing those feelings to control your entire emotional world. And maybe that's the shift. You're not necessarily saying, I don't care anymore. Maybe you're saying, I care. But I can't keep exhausting myself over something I can't control. And I think that's where this Two of Cups becomes interesting because this card makes me think about the connection itself. The fact that something between you and this person may have felt real to you, important, mutual, at least in some moments. And maybe that's exactly why letting go has been difficult. Because you're not trying to convince yourself that nothing happened. You're not pretending you never felt anything. You're just starting to realize that a connection can matter and still not deserve every piece of your peace. And I think that's a very different kind of letting go because this isn't necessarily dramatic. You're not standing up and making some big declaration. You're not necessarily trying to prove anything to them. You're just slowly returning to yourself. And maybe you don't even realize how different that feels from the outside. Because before, the silence between you may have felt like something you were carrying. You were the one wondering, waiting, trying to understand. But now, the silence is just becoming silence. And I think that might be the part they notice. Wait, because think about it. When you stop reacting to the distance in the same way, the distance changes. Not because there are suddenly more miles between you, but because you're no longer emotionally standing at the edge of it. You're doing other things, thinking other thoughts, having moments that don't belong to this connection anymore. And maybe that quiet change is more noticeable than any confrontation would have been. Because you can argue with someone, you can explain yourself, you can tell them exactly how hurt you are. But when you simply stop reaching in the same way, there isn't always anything to argue with. There's just space. And maybe that space is starting to force this person to sit with something they didn't have to sit with before. Because if you are no longer carrying the connection emotionally, what are they going to do with the part of it they've been avoiding? I think it may be because they've been able to avoid thinking about something for a long time. And now, maybe that's becoming harder. Because as long as they believed you were still emotionally there, they could stay quiet. They could put things off. They could tell themselves there was always more time. Maybe they didn't even realize they were doing that. But think about it. Acknowledging that you really care about someone can be complicated. Because once you admit it, then what? Do you reach out? Do you explain yourself? Do you risk hearing something you don't want to hear? Do you have to take responsibility for the silence? And maybe that's what they've been avoiding. Not necessarily their feelings themselves, maybe what those feelings would require from them. Because it's one thing to quietly care about someone, it's another thing to do something about it. And maybe before, they didn't feel pressured to make that choice. Because somewhere in the back of their mind, you were still there, still caring, still emotionally connected. So they could stay in that comfortable space of not knowing what to do. But now, I don't know, that space may not feel so comfortable anymore because what if you're actually moving on? What if the reason you're quiet isn't because you're waiting? What if you've simply started living without expecting them to come back? And I think those questions may start appearing in moments they didn't expect. Maybe when they're alone, maybe when something reminds them of you, and suddenly there's this thought, did I wait too long? And maybe they push it away at first, but then another thought comes in. What if they really are moving on? What if I don't get another chance? And that's where I think the emotional pressure starts building. Because before, silence may have felt like something they were choosing. Now, maybe they're starting to realize that silence has consequences. And the strange thing is, you may not even be trying to teach them that. You're just tired. You're trying to find peace. But your absence from the emotional role you used to play may be forcing them to look at something they've avoided. And I think that's the real shift here. Because maybe the problem isn't whether this person has feelings. Maybe the problem is whether they can keep pretending those feelings don't require them to do anything. The Chariot comes in here. And this feels like the point where something starts moving emotionally. Not necessarily outwardly, not yet, but inside, something may be getting harder for this person to ignore. Because regret is interesting. Sometimes regret isn't just, I miss them. Sometimes it's, I could have done something differently. And I think that's a much heavier feeling because missing someone can stay abstract. You can push it away. You can distract yourself. But when you start remembering the moments where you actually had a choice, that's different. Maybe they start replaying a conversation, something you said that they didn't fully respond to. Maybe there was a moment when you were clearly trying to understand where things stood and they gave you nothing. Or maybe they did say something, but not enough. And at the time, maybe they thought there would be another conversation, another opportunity, more time. And I think that's where this Chariot feels important because suddenly time doesn't feel as predictable anymore. You are changing. And the more you stop carrying this connection the way you used to, the more they may have to sit with the fact that they can't just assume you'll always be there. And maybe that's when certain memories start feeling different. A message they didn't answer, a moment they pulled away, something they wanted to say but didn't. And now, maybe they wonder what would have happened if they had handled it differently. But I don't think this means they suddenly know exactly what to do. That's the thing. Regret doesn't automatically remove fear. They may still have pride. They may still be uncertain. They may still wonder if reaching out would even matter now. Because what if you've changed too much? What if they finally speak? and you're not standing in the same emotional place anymore. And meanwhile, this is where the contrast gets really interesting because you may actually be feeling calmer, not perfect, not like you've forgotten everything, but calmer because you're no longer carrying every unanswered question by yourself. And maybe while you're slowly finding peace, they're becoming more uncomfortable with the things they never addressed. Because now the emotional weight may be shifting. You used to be the one sitting with all of it, the wondering, the waiting, the silence. And maybe now some of that is landing back with them. And I think that's when regret starts becoming real. Not just because they miss you, but because they may finally understand that they had moments when they could have acted and they chose not to. So now I'm wondering, when regret finally becomes stronger than avoidance, what does someone do next? Five of Wands, cause. I think about conflict, but not necessarily conflict between the two of you. I think this could be happening inside of them, because maybe now there are two different parts of this person pulling them in opposite directions. One part of them may be thinking, just say something, reach out, explain, ask how they're doing, maybe apologize, maybe just see if you're still there. And honestly, maybe that thought has crossed their mind more than once. But then the other part steps in, and that's where the fear comes from. Because what if you don't respond? What if too much time has passed? What if they finally work up the courage to say something and realize that you're not waiting anymore? Okay, because now this is interesting. Earlier in this connection, you may have been the one wondering whether they would ever choose you, whether they would ever step forward, whether they would ever make it clear that this mattered to them. And now, maybe the question is starting to turn around. Because what if they're beginning to wonder, would they still choose me? Do you see what's happening here? Because that is a completely different position to be in. Before, maybe they felt uncertain about what they wanted to do, but they may not have questioned whether you cared. That part felt familiar, almost guaranteed. And now, maybe that's the part that doesn't feel guaranteed anymore because you've changed. Not necessarily into someone cold, not into someone who suddenly hates them, but you're not standing in the exact same emotional place. And they may be able to feel that somehow. So now, if they come forward, there is risk, real risk, because reaching out could mean hearing something they don't want to hear. It could mean finding out you've moved on. It could mean realizing that the opportunity they thought would always be there isn't there in the same way anymore. And I think that's why this internal battle feels so strong, because silence feels safer. But silence is starting to hurt too. Doing nothing protects them from rejection, but it may also keep them stuck with all of these questions. What are you doing? How do you feel now? Do you still think about them? Would you even want to hear from them? And the longer they avoid finding out, the more those questions may start taking up space. Because at some point, not knowing can become harder than knowing. And maybe that's where they are getting to. One part of them wants to stay quiet, stay protected, pretend nothing has changed. But another part may be getting harder to ignore. The part that knows if they keep doing nothing, they may never know what could have happened. So now, I don't think the question is whether this connection affected them. I think the question is, are they willing to risk everything by finally doing something about it? I think the Eight of Pentacles comes in here, and this is interesting because this card feels like waiting, but not the same kind of waiting you were doing before. No, because earlier in this connection, you may have been waiting for them, waiting for a message, waiting for clarity, waiting for some sign that would tell you, okay, this mattered to them too. And maybe at that point, you would have accepted almost anything, just something, some movement, some explanation. But now, I don't think you're standing in that same place anymore. And that's the part that changes everything, because maybe you still care. I don't think this reading is saying that your feelings just disappeared, but caring about someone and being willing to abandon your own peace for them are not the same thing. Because I think that's the turning point. If this person does come forward, they may be expecting to find the version of you who was still waiting, the version of you who wanted answers so badly, the version of you who maybe would have immediately asked, "Why did you do this? What happened? Why didn't you say something sooner?" But now, maybe you're asking different questions. Maybe you're looking at them and wondering, is this actually good for me? What has really changed? And maybe the biggest question of all, do I even want to go back? And I think that's where the emotional irony is, because this person may finally be getting closer to understanding what they feel. At the exact moment, you're becoming less willing to lose yourself inside the connection. And that's not because you're trying to punish them. I really don't think so. It's just you've had time. Time to sit with the silence. Time to realize that you can survive without the answers you thought you needed. And maybe time has changed you. Not completely, but enough. Enough that if they come back, you may not just be relieved. You may pause, you may listen, but you may also look at the situation differently. Because before, the question may have been, will they choose me? And now, because now the question may be starting to change, what am I choosing? And I think that's why this Eight of Pentacles feels so important. Because you're no longer just waiting for something to grow. You're looking at what you've already invested. You're looking at what this connection has cost you emotionally. And maybe you're wondering whether anything different can actually come from it. So if they do come forward, the biggest surprise may not be what they say. It may be realizing that the person with the real decision is no longer them. This feels like a very interesting, the Eight of Swords to end on, because when I look at this, I think about everything that may have gone unspoken, everything that was avoided, the feelings they may have tried to keep at a distance, the conversations they didn't have, the things they may have told themselves they would deal with later, and maybe that's the whole point, because later has a way of eventually becoming now. And I think this brings us back to where this reading started, the Four of Cups, because you were never just someone who suddenly stopped caring. You were tired, tired of carrying something by yourself, tired of waiting for clarity, tired of wondering whether someone else was ever going to meet you emotionally where you were, and eventually that exhaustion started changing you, not into someone cold, not into someone who forgot what this connection meant, but into someone who began to understand, I can't keep putting my whole life on hold. And maybe that's when something shifted for them too, because you were beginning to let go. And maybe they weren't as ready to let go as they thought, because that doesn't necessarily mean they know exactly what to do. It doesn't guarantee a message. It doesn't guarantee an apology. It doesn't guarantee that they suddenly become the person you needed them to be. But I do think there is a possibility here that as you stopped holding the connection so tightly, they may have finally started feeling what it would actually mean to lose it. And if they do come forward, this is where everything changes, because you don't have to immediately fall back into the old version of this story. You can listen, you can ask questions, you can reconnect. Maybe something really has changed, but maybe you also realize that it hasn't, and that's okay too, because the answer doesn't have to be decided before they even speak. You don't have to promise them anything, you don't have to return to waiting. You don't have to ignore everything you've learned just because the person you once wanted finally comes back. And I think that's the real difference. Before, their decision may have felt like it controlled everything. Whether they reached out, whether they explained, whether they chose you. But now, you have your own decision. And maybe that is the quiet ending to this whole story. Not whether they come back, not whether they finally say everything you wanted to hear, but the fact that you're no longer sitting there believing your life can only move forward once someone else makes a choice. Because somewhere along the way, while you were trying to stop waiting for them, you may have started remembering something important. You get to decide what happens to your heart too, and honestly, maybe that's where the real peace begins. Maybe sit with that for a moment.